LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer First Wednesday Live. This week one was delayed a day because of tech issues, but this is the show I do on the first Wednesday of every month when I have questions people have asked me during the previous month about law, politics, YouTube, or whatever. I'm still licensed to practice law, though I won't give anyone legal advice, but I will also answer some live questions I get from viewers of the show if there are any at the end, though I may not do as well as I do on the questions I can think about beforehand. But post your questions now if you are one of the live viewers at this odd time for Liberal Viewer First Wednesday. Before I get to the couple questions I was asked during the last month, however, I want to take a moment to comment on one of the Supreme Court decisions that came out this week, Alanis versus United States, that looked at the conviction of a man for posting threats on Facebook and whether the jury was properly instructed on the law. I think this ruling's been really misunderstood in the media, and as one example, I want to show part of how Larry Wilmore covered the case on the Nightly Show Tuesday. And this is kind of funny in parts, but it's actually kind of misleading a little by the end, as I'll explain after you watch that clip over here.
What sort of violent stuff was this man posting anyway?
One of the messages concerning his estranged wife said, "One way to love you, 1,000 ways to kill you."
One way to love you, 1,000 ways to kill you. Okay, there are two ways to look at this. Number one, it's a horrible thing to say about your spouse, or it's the worst Hallmark card ever. Horrible. All right, this is a sick audience tonight. Okay, that 1,000 ways to kill you thing is a little creepy, but is that really worth, taking this guy all the way to the Supreme Court?
Another one of the messages says that there were enough elementary schools in a 10-mile radius to initiate the most heinous school shooting ever. He also talked about dumping her body in a creek.
Whoa. Okay, this guy is clearly psychotic. All right, what was their reasoning to overturn it? Because it sounds pretty dangerous to me.
And that's not sufficient to convict a person based on how a reasonable person would perceive the threat. In this case, these Facebook messages.
I think a reasonable person would hear, "I want to dump your body in a creek," as a reasonable threat.
Now, of course, it's a comedy show, but Larry Wilmore there is totally mischaracterizing the issue. It's not about whether a reasonable person would see it as a reasonable threat. It's whether that's the correct standard to convict someone of this federal crime. The federal crime is for making threats of injury on means of communication using interstate commerce, like Facebook. And the person in this case was convicted with a jury instruction that said all the prosecution had to prove was that that a reasonable person would have found his posts threatening. You can see from the actual case. This is the actual jury instruction from the case. A statement is a true threat when a defendant intentionally makes a statement in a context or under such circumstances wherein a reasonable person would foresee that the statement would be interpreted by those to whom the maker communicates the statement as a serious expression of an intention to inflict bodily injury or take the life of an individual. So the prosecution only had to prove that a reasonable person would have found the Facebook post threatening, but what the defendant in this case wanted, and what the Supreme Court eventually agreed with, was that there had to be the defendant himself the prosecution had to prove that he knew that the posts were threatening. Here you can see also from the case, Alanis requested a jury instruction that the government must prove that he intended to communicate a true threat, so that he knew it was threatening. But of course, the status of this case is that it's been reversed and remanded, which means even though the guy's conviction has been overturned, he gets to go and have another trial. And this time the jury will be instructed that if they look at those Facebook posts, they have to find that he actually knew that the posts he was putting on Facebook were threatening. And the chances are he'll be convicted again if there isn't some sort of plea bargain, if it actually goes to a jury trial. But they're not saying that this guy gets off because the threats didn't fit this reasonable person standard, like what Larry Wilmore was claiming there. That was like totally misleading. The case is actually about what the level of intent is, and the Supreme Court found that he has to have the purpose or intent to threaten, and then they left open the possibility that recklessness might be possible. That the defendant in the case, if he recklessness means he knowingly disregarded the high probability that they would be threatening. So that's also a level of intent. But that's what the case was about, and it didn't even say the guy was not going to be convicted of making the threats. It just said that it had to go back and get a different instruction for the jury, because in criminal law you don't want to convict people unless they actually intend to commit a crime, or that's the reasoning that the Supreme Court used. So I wanted to start off by talking about that, and I see I have a few of you here who are watching the show live. If you want to post any questions for me to answer at the end, I'm going to cover a couple questions I had people ask me over the last month. First, I had a question from Terry Alther, who asked me questions almost every month, and this was about corporate personhood. You can see here that, I don't know if you can read that, but he's putting a link to this Occupy Democrats post that in question for first Wednesday, June. I've noticed that there isn't a clear consensus regarding the concept of corporate personhood, especially in the aftermath of the recent currency scandal with memes like this. If corporations are people, how come 5 major Wall Street banks, including Citi and JP Morgan Chase, just pled guilty to felony charges of rigging markets to enrich themselves in a self-described cartel, and not a single person involved is going to jail? Well, they actually did get several banks to plead guilty to a crime, which is better than like the Eric Holder Justice Department has done over the last 6 years, where they get them to pay fines but not admit any wrongdoing, and that's a problem. But on the subject of corporate personhood, the fact that the corporations plead guilty to a crime doesn't preclude individuals being charged with a crime. And sometimes the corporation can be guilty when no individual is guilty. That's one of the reasons corporate personhood is actually good, to help people or help prosecutors charge corporations with crimes. Because, for example, suppose there's someone in a corporation that knows that this paint is poisonous, and then there's someone else in the corporation who knows that the corporation is going to use this paint on children's toys. But no one in the corporation knows both those things. So no person actually knows that they're putting poisonous paint on children's toys, but the corporation is imputed to know everything that all its officers know. And so the corporation could actually be guilty of the crime of putting poisonous paint on children's toys, even if no individual in the corporation knew that the paint was poisonous and that it was going on children's toys. So that's one way that corporate personhood actually helps hold corporations accountable. The other way that corporate personhood helps hold corporations accountable is because a lot of crimes and even civil torts, civil harms, are written in terms of people having a level of intent. It's kind of like what I was talking about in that Facebook threats case, that you have to knowingly or intentionally do something in order to be guilty of a crime, or you have to do it recklessly, which is a conscious disregard of a high level of risk. And for all those types of crimes and torts that require those levels of intent, you have to treat the corporation like a person if you're going to pretend that the corporation can intend to do something. Because, of course, corporations, in reality, they don't intend anything. They're just a group of people doing stuff, and maybe the people intend stuff. But if you want the corporation to be held accountable for something that requires a level of intent, you have to pretend it's a person, and pretend it has knowledge of all the people in it, and pretend the things that it does it intended to do like it was a person. So that's another way in which corporate personhood helps hold corporations accountable, both in civil cases and to charge them with crimes. And actually, I have a bunch of videos about campaign finance, corporate personhood, and Citizens United. I've put a link down in the video description to that. There's also a link down in the video description to that full Larry Wilmore Nightly Show episode. And there's a link down in the video description to the Supreme Court case in Alanis versus United States on Facebook threats. But if you want more about my views on corporate personhood, I think Is It Just Corporate Free Speech is the one that deals with that most directly. So I had one other question that I was asked during the last month. This was just before my show over on one of my videos. Pat's Rule 213 asked question for LiberalViewer First Wednesday. what do I think about the Jill Stein presidential candidate for 2016? And he put a link to her issues, and I put a link down in the video description to the questions. I think for that one, if you click on the link to Pat's Rule 213's question, you're going to have to like show all of the replies in that linked comment thread to actually see his comment, because it doesn't show up if you just click on it, because it's a comment in one of my previous videos. Anyway, Jill Stein is a Green Party candidate, and in some ways I admire people who work for the Green Party. I know several people locally who work for the Green Party and have even been Green Party candidates here in Sacramento and for some local and even statewide offices. And it takes a lot of commitment. It's kind of a really small part of the population. I've talked about third parties before, and given the fact that I have studied history, American history, and some parliamentary European history. History was my major in college, and I have an undergraduate degree in history. I understand that third parties have never really gotten a lot of traction in the United States, and maybe I have too much of a historical perspective because, past performance doesn't necessarily show you what future results are going to be, but at least in the United States, third parties, at least since like the Whig Party and we disappeared and we got into our current real two-party system in the United States, third parties haven't really been very successful, except occasionally bringing up issues that then get adopted by one of the two parties in our two-party system. And there are advantages and disadvantages to the United States system. I think it keeps us fairly centrist. It's sort of a guard against going too far to the right and fascism, and too far to the left into communism, both of which I think fascism and communism are too far. Maybe some of my viewers disagree. I think especially I have maybe one or two communists who view my show every now and then, or I know I have several socialists, which isn't the same thing. But I think one of the advantages of our two-party system, especially for national presidential candidates, is that it keeps us centrist and keeps us from going too far to the extremes. In Europe, they've had much more problems with both fascism and communism than here in North America, at least continental Europe. So that's an advantage, but it does keeps the status quo in the United States much more stable. It's much harder to change things. There are so many parts in the system that are designed to stop things from happening that you really have to have a big consensus to get anything to happen. I guess maybe Obamacare is an exception where it was very partisan, but even that, there was a big national consensus on most of the individual items in Obamacare, even if Obamacare itself had a bad rap. But I just think that the Green Party and other third-party candidates can sometimes bring good ideas into the debate, but the way the American system works, I don't have a lot of confidence that they're ever going to get the traction necessary, especially in a presidential campaign. There may be in some individual congressional districts some room to make some movement, and that actually our congressional campaigns work a little bit to the opposite of the way that the national presidential campaigns move people to the center. But because of the way our districts are gerrymandered, sometimes in the Republican and Democratic Party, members of Congress, not the Senate, but the House of Representatives, are pushed to, Republicans to the right and Democrats to the left, because all they're really worried about is a primary challenge. They have gerrymandered districts where they easily make it in the general election. And in those type of districts, I think third parties can actually have some ability to draw away from the two parties. So in congressional elections, maybe, but Jill Stein is running for president in 2016 as the Green Party candidate. And, I know people hate to hear the word spoiler. I know third party people really hate that word, but, that's what Ralph Nader did in 2000. I don't think it's really much of a question. It's pretty undeniable that Ralph Nader cost Al Gore the election in 2000. And for the foreseeable future, unless you build through the congressional candidates and build a real party, national party base, I don't think that third-party candidates have much of a chance unless they have a huge amount of money. There's a possibility of some, like Michael Bloomberg or Ross Perot or somebody like that coming in with his own money and building on the disgust that a lot of people have with the two-party system, and I'm not denying that. And so maybe if there were money, but the Green Party is all about, these really important issues, many of which I agree with, but which I don't think necessarily have the big consensus necessary to overturn the two parties using the Green Party platform. So that's my answer to that question. I don't think that a lot of people showed up for the live show just because it's at a strange time. I guess I got a couple dozen here watching. Let me see if anyone actually asked me any questions live before I finish up the show. Is Jeb the older brother? Well, Google that. I think Jeb is actually, I think he is the older brother, but I could be wrong about that. Palin Perry 2016. I have a question about copyright on YouTube. If anybody knows anything about that issue, well, I do know about that issue, but I can't give out legal advice. You can send me a private message, and if I have some time in the next few days, I might try to answer it on copyright issues, but I don't see any specific questions down there, and even though the show's only been going on for, it looks like it stopped streaming somewhere in there. What's it say here? Anyway, I'm having problems figuring out why it says 8 minutes when this says 17 minutes. Maybe I stopped broadcasting at some point in there, but I appreciate all of you who showed up for the live show, and I hope that you enjoyed my answers to the questions, and I'll be doing my regular Sunday show, LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup, Sunday 6:30 p.m. Pacific. So join me for that, when I'll have all the best clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows and some from Bill Maher on Friday night. And until then, I guess I'll be seeing you all around the internet.